Hi, and welcome back to Philosophy 110 Online. This is the second lecture for Unit 1, How to Read and Write Philosophy. Before we actually get started into the material, I'd like to hit a couple of housekeeping notes. I won't do this every time, but since this is the first unit in the first week and we're just getting into the rhythm of things, well, here's a few reminders for you. In case you haven't noticed, or in case you've forgotten, the Unit 1 journal and quiz are both due at the end of this unit, 6/19, at 11:59 p.m. If you miss the due date, remember, the assignment will close and you will not be able to turn it in. I don't care when you get it done, so long as it's done by June 19th at 11:59 p.m. That should be Sunday night, I believe. Don't forget to compare everything you've been doing up against the unit checklist. The unit checklist is your friend. If you don't believe this, repeat it to yourself until you do. The unit checklist lists everything that you've got to do for a given unit. So long as you're doing everything on that list, you're going to be doing just fine. If you have any questions at all about the material, I know it's rather fast and there was quite a bit from the last lecture, but if you've got any questions at all, please don't hesitate to contact me and ask questions. There is a live instructor for these, even though you're doing it at your own pace. The last thing, housekeeping-wise, is that this lecture in particular is going to assume that you've already completed Lecture 1 as well as the first 4 readings. Feel free to listen to this one before doing the others, but if you haven't, I highly recommend stopping and going back and viewing the other lecture and going over the other readings. In particular, the excursus reading, a little bit of logic, because I'm going to use a lot of the vocabulary and the concepts from that in this video and all the videos going forward. If you don't have the argument like vocabulary, valid, invalid, and so on, you're going to have a hard time with some of these assignments and with some of the things that I talk about. So, with all that, let's go ahead and clear up what this lecture in particular is going to be about. This is another one of those things that's been highly requested by students in the past in order to help you out with actually doing the class. This lecture is going to in particular cover how best to do the readings, what's expected of you when you write for the class, like for example the journals and the exams, which will be essay format, as well as how to make the most of your study time for this class. Even though this is online and you can put as much or as little effort into this as you like, you're going to have to do at least some work outside of what's required so that you can best understand the readings, you can formulate your own thoughts on things. It's like any other class. There's going to be time that you have to spend studying, even if it's a little unorthodox. Now, the reason why I want to take some time to do this is not only that students in the past have requested it, but because the readings and the material that we look over is not like almost anything else that you study. Philosophical writing is kind of unique in that it takes more work to get through it than the ordinary literature. If you looked over the syllabus, you probably noticed that the readings are actually usually on the shorter side. I think one of our longest ones is only about 17 pages or so, and that's honestly about 3 times as long as most of them. Some are only 2 or 3 pages. But don't get cocky about how little time you can spend on them, because philosophical writing is usually some of the densest and most complicated things that human beings have written. It's not like going through an ordinary literature class or even an ordinary textbook. You see, while philosophy as a field tries to clarify and better understand ideas, a lot of philosophers have been brilliant people who are also terrible, terrible writers. Some of them are excellent, but some of them are less clear than they should be, and the ideas and distinctions that they make are often much more subtle rather than obvious. So, while this may sound like obvious advice to give, some of the things we'll cover in this lecture, I actually believe that you will find it very helpful in the long run that we went over these things today. And especially, I think it'll help you as we go over understanding what it is that these people are often trying to do. Now, another question that's probably worth clearing up is why in the world are we bothering reading a lot of the historical stuff? In the last lecture, I talked about how philosophy is trying to address fundamental concerns, to try and analyze fundamental concepts and ideas, and often analyze questions that we don't really understand the answers to. So why not just try and answer these ourselves? Why not just do really big discussion groups or have you write nothing but journals? And the answer for this is that reading, critiquing, and understanding historical works of philosophy is actually really useful for developing our own skills in doing it. I never want to actually tell you what to think. In fact, it's 110% okay that you disagree with anything that I ever advocate for in these lectures, or any responses that you get to your essays. I want you to have your own thoughts on things. But in order to develop those thoughts, I want you to actually put some effort into actually coming up with your own ideas and getting excellent reasons for those ideas. In order to do that better, studying historical philosophy will help you build up necessary skills. It's sort of like the concept of a master's study in art. So in traditional art education, like the traditional way of learning how to make masterful drawings and paintings and other things, what art students will often do is actually copy, stroke for stroke, mark for mark, the works of a famous master like Leonardo da Vinci or Rembrandt or Picasso or somebody like that. And by copying exactly how those artists made their art, they actually learn little techniques and tricks and understandings of the material, as well as perspective and color and value and the rest of it. By copying things, they learn those little tricks that make their own art come together all the better, because they're learning what the masters did that made their work so wonderful, that made it such, moving things. We can do something so similar in philosophy. By studying what other people, these particularly brilliant historical and contemporary figures, thought about these questions and issues, and by seeing how they reached those positions, we'll actually be able to start noticing strategies and methods and sides to issues that we may not have otherwise thought about. It may have never occurred to you that there could be, this kind of confusion in ethics, or that this was actually even a problem for a viewpoint, or that maybe this had these kinds of implications. But by studying historical philosophy, or by studying particularly important contemporary works in philosophy, not everybody will read is dead. By studying these, we'll better learn how to incorporate their skills and the issues that they discover into our own thinking. So in other words, this class isn't a history class. I don't want you to just memorize what everybody thinks on these issues. Instead, we're going to be using history to learn how to better do philosophy ourselves. So a lot of your readings will be focused on understanding historical and contemporary theories about these, and your assignments will be half about making sure that you understood what those were about, but also using some of their techniques and ideas to develop your own thoughts on these issues. I want you to think for yourselves. Philosophy is about learning how to think, not what to think. Now, all that said, let's start digging into what a philosophical essay actually is constituted by. Now remember that philosophy is done by asking questions and arguing for various positions. It's not about experimentation and lab results and data sets and things like that. Now, this means that most, if not all, philosophical essays are actually argumentative essays. That means that they're trying to argue for some thesis, some position. Usually it's the conclusion of an argument, but it may just be a whole network of arguments that are trying to prove the same kind of point. Now, usually they'll do this by providing reasons and evidence for that position, and those kinds of evidence may be of individual arguments. One particular famous philosopher that we won't be looking over in this class, Immanuel Kant, for example, is very well known for his entire book on whatever subject he's writing to be one giant argument, whose substeps are arguments. So all of their works will be trying to prove some particular point. And this isn't unusual. Argumentative essays show up quite often. Virtually every political speech that you'll ever look at, any opinion piece in a newspaper, or even advertisements are usually trying to convince you that something is true, or convince you to do something in the case of like ads and a lot of other things. Everything that tries to convince you of something is an argumentative piece of literature or media or whatnot. Now, this is very different from an informative essay, which simply tries to inform the reader about a topic. And these are going to be your run-of-the-mill newspaper articles, most textbooks, and probably most of your past research papers. An informative essay explains and informs about a topic without trying to convince anyone of anything. Now, the reason why I tell you this sort of thing is that the things that you'll be reading, as well as the things that you'll be writing, are not just going to be explaining some position. Instead, they're going to be trying to convince you of something, and you're going to be trying to convince me of something as well, such as such and such believed this, or that this side of the issue is correct, But this also means that when you're reading an essay, that you should be keeping in mind that the author is trying to convince you of something. Every author has a single position that they're either defending or supporting or analyzing in some way. They're trying to endorse or convince you of a position. Unless they explicitly say that they don't believe in whatever it is they're talking about, you can usually assume that they believe that position is true. Now the author will be using arguments to support that claim, and they may even consider, and then usually reject, arguments against it. But no matter how back and forth an author may look on an issue, how many different sides they talk about, the author does still have one position in particular that they're trying to defend and make seem true and convincing. So that means in every essay you read in here, there's two things in particular that you should focus on. The thesis, that is the point that the author wants to make, as well as the arguments, how the author gets to that position. So those are the two things you should be looking at any time we do a reading in this class. With the exception, perhaps, of the first couple of essays that we read, which were honestly just things trying to explain and show what philosophy was and why it's useful to people. Now, as for actually reading philosophy, in order to try and get those two things that are the most important, the position and how they got there, some general tips are to read an essay multiple times. Remember how I said that these things are usually dense and complicated and you shouldn't be thrown off by how short they look? The reason why I assign short readings is not just because the textbook has them. I picked the textbook because it has short readings, but I want you to read essays multiple times. Usually 2 or 3 will do the trick. If not, read as many times as it takes. These readings are very dense. If you don't understand an individual sentence, the best thing to do is to try and find the context. It's to reread the sentence, reread the paragraph, reread the section until you understand what it is that it's trying to do. Now, another very general tip, which has honestly almost been useful to me in my career, is that if you can, you should read with a pencil. Now, most of you are probably either renting or buying your textbooks. Probably a handful of you maybe got the digital editions. If you have either bought the book or you're using a digital edition, read in some way in which you can mark the text. In particular, physical marking is the absolute best. But if you're using a digital, go through with like a highlighter tool in whatever reader you're using. By underlining key passages, marking things you don't understand, maybe numbering the steps in an argument, or anytime it says first, blocking it off. Anytime it says second, block that off. Anything you do to make it easier to read and easier to keep track of what's going on, the better you'll be when you read through these things, as well as when you go back to study it. In addition to being useful in the long run, this is also useful while you're reading because it forces you to actively engage the text. You're not just going to be sitting back and passively reading it and skimming it, because if you just do that, if you just passively try and soak it all in, well, then chances are your eyes will just start to glaze over and you'll reach the end of a page and wonder, well, wait, what? What is he talking about? Why did he say such a thing? You do end up not remembering anything from the individual text. So if you go through and mark in the pages during your multiple readings, then I guarantee you'll more actively read and you'll actually absorb more information. And this is a good advice for any class, but especially for philosophy. If you're renting the book and you don't feel like you can write in it without at least getting some fine, I would honestly consider the worth of potential fines and whether or not that's worth getting a slightly better grade in the class, because chances are you will do better if you do mark in it. If you still choose not to mark in it and not to risk fines, good for you, you're respecting other people's property. But instead, go ahead and look, say, for post-it sticky notes, or bookmarks, or some other way to actively engage the text and mark the things in it. You can do so in non-permanent ways. But no matter what, I highly recommend you guys do something to cover those pages or those fields of text in some way that makes it more comprehensible to you. And the last general tip, just from things on reading philosophy, is to go slowly and look to context and purpose. Remember when I said that you need to go back and make sure you understand every sentence and so on and so forth? Well, most of these philosophers, they say everything that they do for a purpose. They think that this sentence or this paragraph is adding some bit of evidence, or it's considering this alternative viewpoint, and you need to be able to understand what each individual thing says. You can't just skip that paragraph because it doesn't look important. So if you don't understand an individual sentence, go back and read the sentences before and after it. Try and identify what it's trying to do, what its purpose is. What work is it doing in the essay? Because remember, they're trying to convince you of something. They're trying to accomplish a goal. So each of those individual sentences and passages should also be trying to do a goal. Is that passage, supporting a conclusion? Is it an objection that they're considering? Is it restating from something earlier in a new and different way? Or is it actually moving on to a new point? Where does he switch from this topic to this topic? These are things that you should be keeping an eye on. Now, I know that that's going to be tough. It's something you've probably never done before. But if you can get in the habit of trying to do this, by the end of it, I guarantee you'll be reading and judging these things like a professional philosopher and not just an intro student. Not only will you get more out of the text and get more personal benefits from it, but you will do better in the class. Now, in addition to these general tips, your textbook actually has a set of excellent steps of literally the process that you should go through when you both read and write philosophy. So if you haven't done the reading attached for today's lecture, the How to Read and Write Philosophy at the very end of the textbook, I highly recommend that you actually do this one. Don't skip it for the sake of time or anything else like that. But for the sake of going over these, I've included them in the lecture as well. So, here are some of the steps from the textbook. For one, you really need to read these with an open mind. Don't just assume that whatever essay you're reading is old-fashioned or wrong or silly or absolutely perfectly correct. Because all of these are going to have different positions, and I guarantee, because of the way the class is set up, you will read something that you very strongly disagree with. We read a lot of for and against papers. We'll read one for a position, then we'll read another one that's against that same position. So it's pretty much guaranteed you will read something that you disagree with. However, what I want you to do is be charitable in your reading of these. Remember that the people we're reading are very, very intelligent people. Some of the most intelligent to have ever lived. These are people who multitasked into the sciences. Plato and Aristotle essentially invented the modern process of science and discovery and invention. Without them, there would be no Western civilization. And so when we read their topics on ethics or their things from metaphysics or epistemology or anything else, we're reading people who, although they may have been wrong, they had good reasons for the kind of position that they had. So I want you to at least have an open mind and think that it's possible that any given person is correct, or at the very least that they're not making some massive, obvious mistake. Wait to evaluate the argument until after you understand what they've said and why that the author thinks that that particular thing is true. People can be wrong, including smart people, but wait until afterwards to judge it. Don't have any preconceived notions when you go into these things. The second thing that you ought to do, according to the book, and I highly endorse, is to read actively and critically. This doesn't just involve the marking up with a pencil and not just passively absorbing things, but it also has to do with your attitude towards the reading. Don't just take everything that the author says as gospel, or that is just as absolutely correct, or just gloss over the hard parts. Just because somebody says that something is so, doesn't mean that it is. They can be wrong about these individual things. Follow the general guidelines that I gave you about how to mark and going through slowly and reading multiple times, and ask yourself whether each individual claim that the author says is true. So again, just because it's in the essay or in the book doesn't mean that it's actually fact. And you'll see a couple of places where authors will disagree about even basic matters of fact. These are things to keep an eye on. As far as the practical process of reading goes, probably the first thing that you want to do when you read a piece is to identify the conclusion first. You need to understand what it is that the author is trying to argue for. And this goes back to the idea of an argumentative essay. Remember, all of these are trying to convince you of something. So, you need to try and identify what it is that the paper, the article, is trying to argue for. Probably the single biggest mistake that I've seen people do when they're doing a philosophy course, or even just doing professional philosophy, is that they claim that somebody said something when really they were arguing the opposite. And as far as grading goes, that's probably the single biggest mistake that I'm going to count off for people. That's going to be the one that really tanks your grade on things. Because you need to actually understand what it is that an author is trying to argue for. If you don't understand that, I don't have good reason to think that you understood the argument or the steps in it or the topic very well at all, because you couldn't even grasp the point of the whole piece. So, as far as the practical steps for reading go, identify the conclusion first of any argument, of any article, of any essay, and then understand what are the reasons for it. Another thing as far as practical steps go is when you're studying and reading these essays, it's a good idea to see if you can actually reconstruct the argument in your own words. That means like getting an extra sheet of paper or a note card or something like that, and after you've read a piece, say after the first or second time, go through and actually see if you can write out step by step what the person was talking about. What did they say in the essay? If you can't do that, then chances are you don't understand it well enough. Because when you're asked to talk about, say, Plato's argument for why you should be moral, if you can't say, well, Plato argued it by doing this, this, and this, then chances are you didn't understand it well enough. You don't have a clear enough idea of what it is Plato thought to distill it down into distinct steps. Now, I'm not trying to, condemn you or scare you off from this. I'm trying to give you an excellent study strategy here. This is something that should be able to help you. This is something that if you do it, you'll make your study time much more effective than if you just read and reread 20 times before the next test or something like that. Now, the last thing as far as steps for reading go is that you should evaluate the argument, that is the argument as a whole, not just individual claims, and form a tentative judgment about whether or not the author is correct. You see, at this point, you've read critically and actively, you've evaluated some of the individual claims, that is, you've seen whether or not some of the individual steps were right, you've tried to make sure you understood the argument as a whole, and you have an idea of what it's trying to accomplish. At this point, you should have a clear idea of the steps of the argument, its purpose, as well as how everything fits together. So now you've got a good enough understanding of the author and its argument to actually say, are they right? Because each of these people, remember, is trying to argue for a particular position. So one of the key things we'll be doing in trying to understand your own reasons and your own thoughts about a given subject is to see whether or not you agree with this very intelligent person that we're reading. Did they make you change your mind about something? Are they giving you reasons that you agreed with or that you already believed in the first place? And I want you to really be honest with yourself about things. Again, remember, we're going to be reading things that you definitely will disagree about at some point. And it's possible that these people will make you change your mind about things. That's not meant to be a scary topic, because being honest with yourself about these things is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Because hopefully when you get convinced of a new position, you're being convinced of something that's closer to the truth, if not the truth itself. I don't know which of these things will be. Each of us will have different opinions about this. But it's a good thing to actually have reasons for what you believe, and to believe whatever's actually true, not just whatever's convenient or useful or traditional. On the other side, if they say something that you do agree with, it's a wonderful thing to have reasons for it. It's a wonderful thing to have doubted yourself and say, well, hang on, am I believing the right thing when I believe this? Doubting your beliefs is not bad. In fact, it helps you build back up those beliefs that are actually correct. In a way, it helps you, quote-unquote, earn that belief. It gives you justification and reasons for what you believe, things that you may not have had before, because you may have just absorbed it from somewhere else. And so in that way, when you read things that you agree with, it's good to still critically evaluate whether you agree with it or not, or whether the person was right or not, to actually legitimately ask and test this. Again, I want to stress that you're never going to be counted off in this class for having the so-called wrong opinion on a given topic. Disagreeing with me or a particular author is one of the best things that you can do. So long as you have reasons for whatever it is you think, and you can back up whatever it is that you're talking about, that you can show that you've deeply and critically thought about a topic, you won't ever get marked off. It's the lacking reasons and having not thought critically about a topic that will get you points taken off on essays. Now, speaking of essays, I want to switch now to how to write philosophy. So if you still have any questions about reading or trying to understand the arguments of a particular author, now's a good time to pause real quick, write down any questions, and try and contact me about them. Alright, all good? So let's move on to actually writing philosophy. So at this point, you've done the readings, you've evaluated the argument, you know what your beliefs are and this sort of thing. So now what? Well, it's time to actually start getting ready to craft an argumentative essay of your own. Almost everything that I ask you to write in this class, whether it be a journal, whether it be an exam response, or whether it's even a long question on a quiz, usually I'm going to be asking you to support a thesis of your own. Now, that thesis may be something very basic and class-related, such as that these two people were similar in X respect and different in Y, or that human beings don't actually have free will and that some philosopher was wrong about some topic, or it may be that Aristotle thought such and such. Each of those things are theses, they are positions, and they may all look different and they may look boring, they may look class-related, but in the end I will be asking you to defend and support some kind of a thesis. So that means whenever I'm grading essays and exams, I'm going to be looking for a few things in particular, because essentially you're writing your own argumentative essay. So that means I will be evaluating it as such. So when I evaluate an argumentative essay, that is when I evaluate one of your essays, these are the three things above all else that I end up looking for. These are the three things that form the biggest part of my grading rubric. So the first one is, do you have a clear thesis? If I don't know what your essay is about, that is, if I don't know what it is that you're arguing for or what you're saying, you will lose major points. If I don't understand what it is you're saying or what you're trying to say, then I can't evaluate it very well. And while I can trust the smart people who are bad writers to have still had a good point, I don't know you guys very well. You may be just that smart as some of our geniuses that we read, but I have no idea that that's actually true. So cut me a little slack and make it easy for me. Have a clear thesis. If you don't, you will lose major points. Now, the easiest way to have a clear thesis, that is to have a thesis statement, is to include the following words in your paper. In this paper, I am going to argue that. Chances are you've been told by English teachers or composition professors or literature nuts that when you're writing very nice and beautiful essays to never say something so obvious. Don't just be that crude. Come up with something more inventive. Well, that's true for writing a lot of literary essays. But in this, we're going to be doing philosophy, and philosophy values clarity above all other things. When in doubt, be more clear. And you can't get any clearer than, in this paper, I am going to argue that. If you include that phrase in your paper and then actually say what it is you're going to be talking about, I guarantee you will never lose points for not having a clear thesis. So, again, you don't have to use these words. You won't be counted off for not using them. But the safest thing you can do to guarantee that you have a clear thesis statement in a philosophy course or in any situation that you're writing an argumentative essay, say the following. In this paper, I am going to argue that. It is a wonderful phrase. Professional level philosophers and writers do it. I've done it, and it's worked out pretty well so far. Now, the second biggest thing that I look for in any argumentative piece of literature, any argumentative essay, anything of yours that I'll be grading essay-wise, are going to be reasons and evidence for the thesis that you're trying to back up. It's not enough to just say, in this paper I'm going to argue that, and then just leave it alone. You must defend that thesis. You have to give reasons and support for why that thesis is true. This is usually what happens in the body of an argumentative essay. This means usually providing your own argument. You may be citing other things as evidence. You may be saying that you've had experiences this, or that it seems this, or that studies have shown X. But in the end, you're going to be providing an argument. You're going to be providing statements and reasons that back up your conclusion. Now, saying I believe is not a really good reason. That doesn't convince anybody of anything except maybe yourself. I don't care that you believe the sky is green. That doesn't give me a reason for thinking the sky actually is green. I want you to back it up in other ways by saying that many people believe this, and these people don't seem like they're crazy. Or, the point is you need to give reasons and evidence for whatever position you're arguing for. Merely saying that you believe it or merely saying that it's true is not enough. Everything, but especially your thesis, your main point, must be supported. And it's this reasoning that'll be the main thing that I end up grading. Now, the third thing that I'm looking for is part of your reasons and evidence. When you talk about these subjects, when you talk about these questions, inevitably, either because they're part of the prompt or because they're useful, you're going to end up talking about the philosophers that we study in class. That is, the ones that you study through the readings and the lectures. So, I need you to have a correct understanding of the philosophers that we study. So, if you say that somebody believed or argued something that they didn't, that's bad. Don't do that. That will count off. Try and only say things that are actually true about what the philosophers believed. The better your understanding of those philosophers, the more details you can give, and the better picture you can paint of their argument, the better you'll do on the essays. So essentially, the essays aren't about regurgitating what the philosophers said. It's not a descriptive or an informative essay, it's an argumentative one. But that doesn't mean that you can just ignore what those other philosophers said. You have to be able to talk about them in a clear and correct, in a way that shows that you actually understood the thing that we've studied in class. Now, again, in order to hit all of these requirements, there's a nice procedure that you can use. Your book's going to have some wonderful guidelines you should follow, but essentially, the process that you should go through in writing an essay that fits all three of my requirements, that hits everything that I'm looking for, will follow the following procedure. If you do these steps, I guarantee you'll write an essay that is pretty dang good. So, first off, you need to pick a topic / read the prompt. In this class, you won't have much in the way of free writing, like choose a topic from one of the things we've studied. That's usually not going to be the case. So instead, you're going to be reading the prompt and see what you need to talk about. In future classes, though, where you do get to pick a topic on something, and you're doing an argumentative essay, that should be the first thing you think about. You need to make sure that you understand what it is that you're being asked to write about. And especially, it's important that you do not leave out part of what the prompt is asking for. If the prompt asks you to, say, compare two philosophers and then say which one is right, you will lose major points, regardless of who the teacher is, but especially for me, if you don't do that last part and say who you think's right. Don't leave off part of the prompt. Don't leave out an important aspect of your topic. Now, the next step that you should do in the process of actually writing a paper will be to do your research. In a philosophy class, this doesn't just mean like going through and doing lab studies or anything. This is going to mean going back over your notes, redoing any readings that you think are relevant, or in the rarer cases, probably not in this class, but in others, actually going out and looking for other essays on the topic that'll be relevant and give you extra information, extra arguments, and other things that you need to consider. This is the part where you do the research part of a research paper, even if the paper is an argumentative one, not an informative one. Next, you need to write a thesis statement. So far you've realized what your topic is, you've looked over the material, and now it's time to actually think about and sit down and say what it is that you want to argue for. You need to decide what it is that you want to say, and see if you can distill it down into a single sentence. If you can't express your point, your topic, in some version of, in this paper I'm going to argue that, chances are you should keep thinking about and trying to refine your position and come up to a clearer understanding of what it is that you believe. Pick a side, have opinions on these things, but then take the time to distill those opinions into a single statement if you can. Remember, you're never going to be counted off for defending the wrong view, only for defending it badly or lacking reasons at all for whatever position you take. So once you have your topic and you've done all of your reading about it, you've considered every side of it, take the time to actually sit down and see if you can distill your own opinion into a single statement. If you can do that, you're ready to move on to the next step. That next step is writing out an outline. Now, some of you I know are probably against writing outlines or doing any sort of pre-writing exercise at all. But if you've not done it before and you're not used to writing argumentative essays, give it a try. Do something new. Try out a new way of writing for a new type of writing. I guarantee you might like it. You may hate it, you may never do it again, but it should actually be pretty useful for you at least the first time to see whether or not it's good for your style of writing. Now, the reason why I recommend doing an outline is because if you're trying to construct an argument, if you write out an outline and actually lay out step by step what it is you're going to be doing, that will stop you from rambling or getting off topic, say halfway through the essay, and then realizing at the end of the night that you've spent all of your words, on assignments that have length limits, and actually said nothing. If you follow your outline, you'll never get off track, you'll never leave something out, and you're guaranteed to cover everything you need to cover. So once you have your thesis statement, actually write out like a skeleton version of your paper. Like have a thesis statement, then write out your explanations in, say, 3 or 4 statements. Write out any objections that you want to consider in 1 or 2 statements, and write out a conclusion. And that type of thing is usually the format that these type of essays take, even at the professional and graduate level. Usually essays go in order: thesis, explanation, along with any arguments you're going to be doing, considering any objections, responding to those objections, and then summing everything up in a conclusion. You don't have to follow that format. There's no requirement to do that. Remember, out of the 3 things I'm looking for, specific order or individual statements aren't part of those, but I guarantee it helps a lot. I really, really recommend, especially if you're not used to doing argumentative essays, that you follow this kind of format. It will help you out a lot. If you're very confident about writing argumentative essays, or you've got a lot of practice doing it, then feel free to try and break away. But this format is traditional for a reason. It works. I use it myself. It's how I'm doing my dissertation. It's a very useful thing to do. Next, in order to actually keep writing out the paper, I recommend that you take that outline and you actually just start expanding on it. So at this point, you've picked what you're writing about, or you've clarified it from the prompt, you've done your research, you've made a thesis statement, and you've outlined the skeleton version of your essay. If you go back and start fleshing out that outline with more and more points, if you made 1 sentence on each of those points, go back and add a 2nd sentence to all of them. Make a twice as thick skeleton of what you did. And then keep doing that. If you keep going through and add more and more support and explanation and discussion about each of the points you make, basically what you'll have done is you'll started from the shortest possible version of your paper, the outline, and you're slowly fleshing it out until you hit whatever length requirement you need. If you're writing a 500-word essay, it won't take you very long to flesh it out. But you can keep doing that until you hit 1,000 words, 10,000 words, 100,000 words. Doing this kind of expansion on an outline is a way to guarantee that you never get off track and that you actually hit your length requirements without having to insert a bunch of bullshit. Because I promise you, as a professional philosopher who does nothing but evaluating arguments and material all day, that I can spot empty, useless bullshit that you insert into your papers. Don't try it, you won't succeed. That's not a dare. You will do badly if you do this sort of thing. But if you follow that outline, you'll stay on track, you'll meet your length requirements, and you won't waste a word. It's an easy way to make sure that you get up to the length that you need. Or, preferably, even just slightly over it, because the next step is also a key part of writing a paper. And that is revise, revise, and revise again. Take the time to actually reread your essay, preferably out loud or to someone else after you've waited a little while. Don't just spend 12 hours at the keyboard spamming out a paper and then hit send. That will get you a completed paper for sure, but it won't necessarily be a good paper. In fact, it's almost guaranteed not to be. See if you can try and complete your assignments with enough time, left on the deadline to actually pause for a little bit, get a wedge, get a cup of coffee, preferably leave it overnight or at least for a couple of hours. Then come back and reread it. If you read it out loud, you actually force yourself to say each individual word, and you'll start noticing how the sentences fit together. You'll see which parts seem like a waste of time, which ones actually support your thesis, which ones actually would maybe by chance prove you wrong, and you'll notice a lot of the things that I'll actually be noticing when I grade it, because I'm looking at it with a fresh set of eyes. I'm going to see every individual flaw and issue and wonderful bit of support that you do. If you go through and notice all of these things yourself by developing a fresh set of eyes on your own paper, you'll catch a lot of these things before I ever see them and make it that much better. And it'll especially make sure that you never actually disprove one of your own statements, because that's bad. And then it also just helps with general writing. It helps make sure that the essay flows well, that it makes sense, that it's pleasant to read. And above all, it helps make sure that you actually say everything that you want to say in an essay. It'll make sure that you actually accomplish everything that's being asked of you. And it'll make sure that you say everything you believe about a given subject. So don't just skip the revising step. It's honestly a key part of writing a complete philosophical essay. Because remember, we want clarity and clear thinking. We want reasons and support. If you write something rough that's not well thought out, well, then you're not really doing one of the key things of philosophy. So, these are some tips for overall writing, as well as reading argumentative literature. I think that they're especially essential, they're pretty much necessary for doing philosophy well. I kind of wish that I'd learned them about 4 years ago. But they'll also be useful for doing any kind of argumentative essay whatsoever, either reading or writing. So, if you follow these guidelines, I almost promise that you will do very well in the class. Your own performance and that sort of thing is still a major factor. You do actually get grades on what you do, not just whether or not you follow my steps. But if you follow these steps, if you follow these procedures, you're much more likely to do well in the class. Don't forget also to watch your due dates and compare anything that you're doing against the unit checklist. Make sure that you don't leave anything off of it. And lastly, be sure to ask any questions you've got about the material, about an assignment, about what we're doing. I'm here to help. I honestly want you to do as well as possible. So good luck, go back over anything you don't understand, and happy writing!